Morning mist lay over the Colorado foothills. Behind a small log cabin, Rebecca Stone worked the thin garden, pulling weeds from cold soil. Her faded brown dress hung loose, and a worn ribbon held her auburn hair in a simple braid. At 23, she was young, but worry already lived in her deep green eyes. Inside, her father's rough cough shook the weak walls. Years of chasing gold dust had ruined his lungs and never paid their debts. Letters from Denver sat in a tin box by his bed, full of dates and threats Rebecca understood too well. Her younger brother and sister still ran barefoot through the rocks, laughing like nothing bad could ever happen. That night the wind pushed at the shutters. Rebecca sat by the low fire, mending a torn shirt, while her father stared into the flames. After a long silence, he told her he could not work the claim much longer. His breath was short. The bank would not wait. He said she would need to marry a man who could provide, someone strong and steady enough to carry the family through the winter. His voice shook with shame, but he did not take the words back. Rebecca kept her hands moving so he would not see them tremble. She did not want to be traded because of debt. She wanted love, or at least choice. Yet when she heard his breath catch and saw fear in his eyes, she could not bring herself to argue. When her family slept, she sat alone at the rough table with a stub of candle. A borrowed book lay open before her, full of stories about distant cities and iron railroads. For a little while the words made the cabin feel wider. She imagined a life where she was more than a miner's daughter at the end of a dirt road. A firm knock broke the quiet. It was not timid. It came steady, as if the person outside knew why he stood there. Her father picked up the old rifle and opened the door. A man stood on the porch with frost in his dark beard and moonlight on his shoulders. He was tall and broad, wrapped in a worn leather coat and canvas trousers. Calm blue eyes looked past the rifle into the room. He stepped inside when her father moved back and took off his hat. He said his name was Caleb Walker, a mountain man who held land higher up in the range. Word of their trouble had reached him. He was not rich in gold, he said, but he had steady work, strong hands, and a place of his own. If Rebecca chose to be his wife, he would settle the worst of the debts in Denver and send enough food and wood to keep her family through the winter. He spoke plain and slow, without charm or fine promises. The cabin went quiet. Her brother and sister watched from the ladder with wide eyes. Her father's cough bent him double, and he had to lean against the table. When he asked Caleb what he really wanted, Caleb answered just as steady. He needed a partner, not a doll, a woman who knew how to work and would stand beside him when storms came. He said he had watched Rebecca in town, hauling sacks and arguing for fair prices, keeping her family together when everything pushed against them. He believed she was stronger than this valley would ever admit. Then he added that he would not drag her away. The choice would be hers alone. With that, he set his hat back on his head and stepped out into the night. For the next few days, Pine Ridge buzzed. After church, women whispered about the poor girl the mountain man wanted to marry. Men at the trading post watched Caleb with narrow eyes and muttered that no one rode out of the high country with an offer like that unless he was hiding something. Rebecca heard it all as she bought flour and salt and counted every coin twice. Caleb came by at dusk and sat on the porch rail while the sky turned deep blue. He did not push her for an answer. Instead, he talked about the high country, about deep snow, clear water, and quiet valleys no one from town ever saw. He spoke of railroads cutting across the land, and big companies hunting for untouched timber. And in a low voice, he said the world was changing fast, and a person could either let it crush them or learn to ride with it. If this story is touching your heart already, let me know in the comments where you are watching from and if you have ever gone through something similar. Also tell me what you would like me to improve in future stories. 2 days later, the creditors from Denver arrived. They rode clean horses and wore neat coats. They spoke to her father in flat, hard voices, named the amount he owed, and talked about taking the claim, the cabin, and even the mule if payment did not come soon. When they rode off, dust settled over the yard, and her father dropped into his chair like a man whose legs could no longer hold him. That night, he told Rebecca that Caleb's offer might be the only way to keep the family together. Without help, the bank would take everything, and the children would likely be split up or sent to the poorhouse. He said he was sorry that his failures had fallen on her shoulders. His eyes shone in the firelight, and his hands shook as he tried to hide how afraid he was. Later, she climbed to the loft and stood before the cracked bit of mirror nailed to the wall. A tired young woman looked back at her, jaw tight, eyes shadowed from too many late nights. She was no longer a girl who could wait for life to be kind. She lay awake listening to the wind claw at the roof and the sound of her father's labored breathing below, and every path she imagined circled back to the same hard truth. At dawn, the peaks turned pale gold under a thin, cold sky. When she stepped onto the porch, Caleb was already there beside a small wagon stacked with sacks and crates. 2 strong horses stamped and blew steam into the chill air. Her brother and sister huddled in the doorway. Her father leaned against the frame, his shoulders bowed, his eyes fixed on her face. Rebecca's heart pulled in 2 directions. Fear and duty tugged her back toward the doorway, while a thin, bright line of hope tugged her toward the wagon and the unknown. She walked down the steps until she stood in front of Caleb. His face was steady and quiet. He did not smile wide or look away. He simply waited for her answer. She told him she would go with him as his wife. Caleb nodded once, as if he understood what it cost her to say those words, and held out his hand. His palm was rough and warm as he helped her onto the worn wooden seat. The wagon wheels creaked as they rolled away from the only home she had ever known, the cabin shrinking behind them until it was just a dark shape against the sky. Ahead, a narrow trail climbed toward the high country. The higher they went, the colder the air became, and tall, dark pines closed in around them like watching giants. Rebecca pulled her shawl tight and stared at the distant peaks. She had married a man who seemed as poor as any miner, for the sake of her family and a small piece of her own hope, and as the wagon rattled deeper into the mountains and the town vanished from sight, a strange feeling settled over her, as if the land itself were holding its breath, waiting to reveal a secret about Caleb Walker and the life he was leading her toward. For 2 days, the trail kept climbing into the high country. The air turned thin and sharp, and every breath felt like it had to fight its way into Rebecca's lungs. Pines crowded the narrow path, and cliffs rose on one side like gray stone walls. Caleb guided the horses with an easy grip on the reins, saying little, his eyes always moving over sky, rock, and trees. They stopped beside a narrow creek to rest the team. Caleb built a small fire and a few careful moves, as if he could do it in his sleep. Rebecca sat on a flat rock with dry bread in her hands and watched him. He looked like any poor mountain man in his patched coat, but nothing about him felt careless. Every rope, every buckle, every step he took seemed neat and planned. That night they slept under canvas, stretched from the wagon to a pine. The stars burned cold above them. Rebecca lay awake listening to the horses shift and the fire sink to coals. Doubt pressed at her. She had tied her life to a man she hardly knew. But then she pictured her father's cough and her brother and sister curled together on their narrow bed, and she reminded herself that she had chosen this path for them. That choice still felt solid in her chest. On the 3rd morning, the land changed. The thick pines thinned into gray rock and scattered aspen, their white trunks bright against the slope. The wagon jolted and creaked over rough ground. More than once, Caleb climbed down to steady a wheel, or walk beside the horses around a sharp turn. A hard wind rushed down from the peaks, snapping at Rebecca's shawl and reddening her cheeks. She studied him as he worked. His coat was worn, but his boots were sound and strong. He spoke to the horses in low, steady tones, like a man used to training good stock. When he paused to scan the ridges, his shoulders squared in a way that did not look like a drifter hunting work. It looked like a man checking on something that already belonged to him. Late in the afternoon, they reached a narrow pass between 2 walls of stone. The sky beyond it glowed a softer blue. Caleb drew the team to a stop. The wagon swayed as he stood there with the reins in his hands, not moving, not speaking. Rebecca asked if something was wrong. He said the roughest part of the road was behind them, but the next hill would change everything. His voice carried a tight edge she had not heard before, like a man bracing for more than bad trail. He clicked to the horses, and the wagon rolled forward through the pass. The trail bent around a cluster of twisted pines, and then the world opened. Below them lay a wide, hidden valley, cupped by steep slopes and dark timber. A clear river cut through the middle, shining in the late light. Even this close to winter, patches of meadow still showed deep green. It looked untouched, quiet, and secret. But the valley was not empty. In the center rose a great lodge, built of heavy logs and stone. Broad porches wrapped around it. Tall windows flashed as clouds moved across the sun. Smoke lifted from chimneys. Fences and barns spread out around it in neat lines. A drive swept from the front door toward the road where they stood. This was not the home of a poor mountain man. It looked like something from the stories in Rebecca's borrowed book, a place owned by someone with money and power. As the wagon started down the winding track, Rebecca gripped the seat. Her heart pounded. She had agreed to marry a man who claimed little. Yet someone who lived here had more than most town owners in Denver. She asked whose place it was. Caleb's answer came quiet and steady. The valley was called Winter Ridge, and the lodge was Winter House. He said it was his home, and now hers too. The words hit her harder than the cold wind. Before she could answer, a tall man stepped out onto the front steps. He wore clean work clothes and polished boots. He walked toward the wagon with an easy, sure stride. He greeted Caleb by name and said they had been expecting him and that everything was ready inside. In that moment, Caleb changed. His shoulders set, his chin lifted, and a calm authority settled over him. The worn coat stayed the same, but he no longer looked like a man asking for a place in the world. He looked like the man who owned it. Inside the front hall, warm lamplight shone on paneled walls. A huge stone fireplace roared at one end of the great room. Soft rugs covered polished floors. Heavy tables and deep chairs filled the space. Paintings of mountains and forests hung between tall windows. The air smelled of cedar, fresh bread, and clean soap. Rebecca walked in slowly, afraid to touch anything. Her hands were used to rough boards and chipped tin cups, not carved railings and smooth porcelain. A woman in a neat apron brought a tray with tea in thin white cups. Rebecca wrapped her fingers around one and almost did not drink, afraid it might break in her hands. When the servants stepped back, the room went quiet, except for the steady crackle of the fire. Caleb stood in front of her. For the first time since she met him, she saw fear in his blue eyes, not fear of snow or cliffs, but fear of losing what mattered. He told her there were things he had not said, not to trick her, he said, but because he needed to know who she truly was, before he laid the full weight of his life in her hands. His true name was Caleb Winters. His father had built a timber company that owned forests, mills, and this valley. When his father died, the business and Winter House passed to him. In Denver, people saw only his money and land. They flattered and schemed. Some tried to tie him to their daughters with soft words and hollow hearts. He had grown tired of feeling like a prize instead of a man, so he had gone into the high country in rough clothes, looking for someone who could see past his fortune. Rebecca listened in silence. Heat rose in her cheeks. She had married him for duty, and because she sensed a steadiness in him. Now she learned that steadiness carried more power than she ever guessed. She did not know whether to feel grateful that her hard choice led here, or angry that he had hidden so much. She asked why he chose her out of all the women he could have had. Caleb said he had watched how she fought for fair weight at the trading post, how she shielded her brother and sister from harsh words, how she met every hardship with a straight back. He said he needed a wife who would stand beside him when others tried to carve up his land and steer his life. Then he told her he would keep his promise either way. If, now that she knew the truth, she chose not to stay, he would still settle her father's debts and make sure the cabin and claim stayed in her family. Rebecca turned toward the fire and watched the flames move over the logs. She thought of her father's cough, her brother and sister's thin arms, the little garden in rocky soil. She thought of this valley, strong and quiet, and the man waiting behind her without his mask. Her heart hurt, but beneath the hurt she felt the same stubborn strength that had carried her through every hard year. She faced him and said she did not need a rich man, but she did need an honest one. Now that the truth was in the open, she would stay. Together they would face whatever storms came to Winter Ridge, whether from the wild peaks or from the fine streets of Denver. The first days at Winter House passed in a blur. Rebecca learned the paths of the Great Lodge, the soft creak of its stairways, and the way the valley held quiet like a blessing. Servants watched her with careful curiosity, unsure whether to treat her as guest or mistress. Caleb kept his word. He walked the land with her, showing her the mill road, the bunkhouses, the barns, the small school he had begun for workers, children. He listened when she asked questions about wages and housing. When she pointed out a drafty wall or a weak roof, he did not brush her aside. He wrote notes and told the foreman to see to it. For a moment she began to believe that this strange new life might find a steady shape. Then, one sharp afternoon, a carriage rolled up the drive with too much polish and not enough dust. Dark horses stamped on the packed earth. A woman stepped out, wrapped in a deep blue traveling cloak, her hair pinned neat as a pin, her gray eyes cold and sharp. Caleb went stiff beside Rebecca. He greeted the woman as his aunt, Catherine Winters. With her came two men in fine city suits. Their boots were clean, their collars stiff, and they wore the look of men who measured the world in profit and loss. Inside, the great room filled with voices that did not belong to the valley. Catherine looked Rebecca over from head to toe, not rude, but not kind either. She called her a surprise. She asked if Caleb had truly married without consulting the board. The word board hung in the air like a storm cloud. One of the suited men explained in slick, careful tones that the Winters Timber Company was on the edge of something big. There were offers on the table, contracts for development, plans that could triple their wealth if they cleared more forest, opened more roads, and partnered with powerful investors from back east. Catherine pressed each word like a weight. For such things, she said, Caleb must present a proper image. A solid, respectable marriage to a woman suited for Denver drawing rooms. Someone from a known family with polished manners, not a mountain girl with dirt still under her nails. Rebecca felt the sting of those words, but she kept her chin lifted. Caleb stepped closer to her and said she was his wife and his choice. Catherine's smile did not reach her eyes. She simply said that choices had consequences, and the board would not risk the company's future for a marriage made in the backwoods. That night, Rebecca lay awake in a room that felt far too grand for sleep. The mattress was soft, the blankets thick, yet her stomach felt tight. Through the window, she could see the valley washed in silver light, peaceful and still. But inside these walls, something sharp and ugly was forming. In the morning, she went looking for Caleb and heard raised voices behind a half-open door. Catherine's tone cut through the hall. She called Rebecca unsuitable, untrained, a burden that would drag Caleb down in Denver society. She warned that investors would walk away if he clung to a woman with no name and no money. Caleb's voice came back rough with anger. He said he would not trade his wife for contracts, that he was not a piece on a board to be moved for someone else's gain. Catherine answered that he was being naive. She said sentiment made men weak, and weakness ruined empires. Rebecca could have slipped away, but something inside her refused to hide. She stepped into the doorway and announced herself. Both of them turned. Startled, her hands shook, but her voice stayed steady as she said that if they were going to weigh her like a bolt of cloth, she had the right to stand on the scale. Catherine's brows rose in thin surprise. She said this was business, that if Rebecca truly cared for Caleb, she would step aside and let him secure the company's future. Rebecca looked her straight in the eye and said that what Caleb needed was not a perfect hostess, but someone who would stand beside him when others tried to tear his home apart. For a moment the room went very still. Caleb looked at her with something like awe. Catherine's eyes cooled. She said there was one simple way to see whether Rebecca could stand the pressure of Caleb's world. The governor's reception in Denver was 1 week away. All the powerful men and women of the territory would be there. If Rebecca could walk into that room, hold her head up, and not crumble under judgment, Catherine said she would at least listen. It was not a kind offer. It was a test meant to break her. After Catherine left, the anger in Caleb's face softened into worry. He told Rebecca she did not have to accept, that he would fight his aunt and the board without dragging her into Denver's games. Rebecca looked down at her work-rough hands, then out the window toward the mountains. She said the fight had already come to her. Catherine had already dragged her name through every parlor and meeting room she could reach. Running would not change that. Better to walk into the light and let them see her clearly than hide in shadows while they tore her apart in whispers. If there was going to be a battle for their marriage and for this valley, she wanted to stand in it, not watch from the edge. Caleb saw there was no shifting her. He promised that whatever waited in Denver, they would face it together. They spent the next days preparing. A seamstress from town came up to the lodge and worked long hours in Rebecca's room, cutting and stitching a gown that felt like a bridge between worlds. Forest green silk for the color of the pines, simple lines that still allowed her to move and breathe. Servants coached her on the basics of formal dining and dance steps. She practiced walking in new shoes on the long hall, learning how to glide without tripping on the hem. Caleb went over papers late into the night, studying contracts and board notes, mapping out how much power Catherine truly had and where their chances lay. When they finally climbed into the coach bound for Denver, the valley lay behind them in clear, cold light. Rebecca watched Winter House shrink against the mountains and silently promised that she would come back stronger. Snow streaked the peaks above them. The road wound down from stone and pine into rolling hills and fenced pasture. As miles passed, the wild gave way to farms, then to crowded towns. Smoke from chimneys thickened the air. Telegraph lines followed the road, thin black ribs holding up the sky. By the time the city rose ahead of them, Rebecca felt like she was entering another country. Denver was busy and loud. Wagons and riders jammed the streets. Brick buildings leaned over sidewalks. People flowed around them in coats and hats of every cut. The coach pulled up in front of a grand hotel with tall windows and a carved stone arch. Gaslights burned even in daylight, casting a rich glow over the doors. Inside, the smell of perfume and polished wood wrapped around her. Men in sharp suits talked in low, serious tones. Women moved in bright silk, their voices light and quick. For a heartbeat, Rebecca felt small, a mountain girl dropped into a world that did not want her. Then Caleb's hand closed around hers. He reminded her that she had faced hunger and blizzards and men with cold eyes long before she ever saw a chandelier. These people had never heard a wolf cry across open snow. They had never stood between a storm and the ones they loved. She had nothing to fear from them that she had not already faced in harder form. Later, as evening fell, they stood outside the ballroom doors. Music drifted through the crack as servants moved in and out, carrying trays that glittered with glass. A man waited to announce their names to the crowd. Catherine was already inside, turning heads, no doubt planting stories with every smile. Rebecca drew a full breath and lifted her chin. On the other side of those doors waited judges, enemies, and maybe unexpected allies. The fate of her marriage and the future of Winter Ridge would be shaped by what happened in that bright room. With Caleb at her side and mountains in her heart, she gave a small nod to the doorman and stepped forward into the light. Soft music drifted through the Denver ballroom as the tall doors opened. Light from the chandeliers spilled over polished floors and bright silk gowns. A man at the entrance called Caleb's name, and Winter's timbre rolled across the room like a drumbeat. Heads turned toward the man in a plain black coat, and the young woman beside him in a green dress the color of pine after rain. For a heartbeat, Rebecca wanted to turn around. The air smelled of perfume and roasted meat. Diamonds and gold flashed in every direction. No one here knew about thin gardens, cracked dishes, or mountain wind that cut through every coat. They knew ledgers and railroads and power. Her heart pounded, but she lifted her chin and stepped forward on Caleb's arm. Men in fitted dark suits moved toward Caleb at once. They pumped his hand and used his first name with easy smiles. Their eyes slid over Rebecca, quick and cool, weighing her and pushing her aside. She felt each look like a touch on her skin, but she kept her shoulders straight and met their glances without blinking. If she could face blizzards and hunger, she could face this polished room. Catherine appeared from the crowd, wrapped in deep red silk, gray eyes sharp over a smooth smile. She greeted Caleb warmly, then let her gaze travel over Rebecca from boots to hair. In a tone just loud enough to carry, she remarked that a mountain girl could be made almost presentable with enough work. A few nearby women smirked behind their fans, waiting for Rebecca to flinch. Rebecca thanked her for sending the dressmaker and said she cared more about strong cloth and straight seams than fancy city ruffles. The words were simple, but they did not bend. One or two of the men hid quick smiles. A thin line appeared at the corner of Catherine's mouth. The blow she had planned had not landed where she hoped. Catherine brought forward a tall man with silver at his temples and polished manners. He was a major investor in a company that wanted deep cutting rights in the winter's forests. He praised progress and jobs and spoke of fortunes to be made in the high country. Then he turned to Rebecca with a pleasant look that never reached his eyes and asked if someone from a tiny settlement could really understand such plans. Rebecca thought of hills stripped bare, brown water, and cabins taken by slides. In a steady voice, she said she understood what happened when too many trees came down too fast. She talked about springs that turned muddy, roads that washed away, and families who paid the price when storms hit cut land. She did not raise her voice. She simply laid down what she had seen with her own eyes. The small circle around them went quiet. The investor's smile thinned. Into that silence stepped another voice, warm and sure. The governor had come close enough to listen. He greeted Caleb, then took Rebecca's hand with respect. He said the territory needed people who knew the high country the way she did, and asked her to keep talking. They spoke for several minutes while listeners drew closer. Rebecca talked about fair wages, safer camps, and cutting timber in a way that left strong forests standing for the next generation. The governor listened and agreed more than once. The feel of the room shifted slightly toward her. Men who had ignored her now watched with careful interest. Catherine stood at the edge of the circle, eyes cold and hard. She slipped away to a knot of serious faces near the wall. When she returned, an older judge walked beside her, carrying a worn leather folder. Catherine's smile looked bright and sharp. She announced that the judge had reviewed Winter's family documents and found a serious concern about Caleb's recent marriage that the board could not ignore. The judge opened the folder and explained that Caleb's inheritance came with strict terms. Any marriage that might threaten the company's stability could be challenged. Certain approvals, he said, had not been filed. In his view, the union did not fully meet the will's conditions. Nearby guests fell silent, hungry for scandal and ready to watch Rebecca fall. The words hit Rebecca like cold water, but they did not knock her down. She asked if she could see the paper. The judge, surprised, handed it to her. She read each line slowly, as she had once read claim notices by lantern light. Her finger followed the cramped writing until she found what she needed. The clause did not only speak about risk. It also said a marriage could be defended if it strengthened the company's standing through public service to the territory and its people. Rebecca asked the judge to confirm that part. He did, less sure of himself now, his voice not quite as loud. She turned to the governor and asked if acting as a voice for mountain families and advising on fair timber laws counted as service in his eyes. He studied her for a long second, then nodded. He said he had already been thinking of such a role, and that her words tonight had settled it. Before the gathered crowd, he asked Rebecca to accept an unpaid appointment as an advisor on high country matters. A secretary stepped forward with a short letter bearing the territorial seal. Rebecca's hand trembled only once as she signed her name in careful strokes. The judge cleared his throat and admitted that her new standing removed any legal question the board might raise. Murmurs moved through the group. Catherine's face went pale, then stiff. The blade she had sharpened had turned in her hand. Caleb stepped to Rebecca's side, thanked the officials with measured words, and told his aunt in a low, steady tone that his marriage was no longer hers to touch. Catherine's lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, she looked like she might argue, but there was nothing she could say that would not make her look small in front of the governor and the judge and half the powerful men in the territory. At last she turned and walked back into the crowd alone, the bright silk of her dress moving like a retreating banner. Later, on the hotel balcony, the city lights below them looked like scattered embers. The air was cold and clean. Rebecca felt the strain of the night and the solid weight of what they had won. Caleb stood beside her and said he had thought he was bringing her into his world, but tonight he had watched her stand in front of it and not bend. She admitted she had been afraid every moment and had done it anyway because some things were worth fear. They rode home to Winter Ridge a few days later. When the hidden valley opened beneath them and Winter House came into view, it looked the same, yet different. It was no longer just Caleb's secret refuge. It was their shared work. Changes came one by one. Workers, cabins were rebuilt stronger. A small schoolhouse opened near the mill road. A trail medic was hired so winter sickness and injury did not turn to tragedy. At board meetings, Caleb fought for better practices. When officials rode up from the city to inspect the operation, Rebecca met them on the porch and walked them through the timber herself. Trees still fell, but new ones were planted. Crews learned to leave strong stands on the slopes instead of bare scars. The company kept making money, but did it on land that could still breathe. Catherine never again tried to undo the marriage. Time and distance wore at her plans. Stories drifted up that some of her city schemes had failed. At Winter Ridge, life moved on without her. Children's laughter began to fill the halls. The great room fire burned warm on winter nights, while Caleb and Rebecca sat side by side, planning the next season instead of fearing the next storm. Sometimes, when wind rushed through the pines, Rebecca stood on the wide front porch and listened. She remembered the thin garden behind her father's failing cabin, the rough wagon on the narrow trail, the first stunned sight of Winter House in the hidden valley, and the bright ballroom where people tried to measure her worth, and she refused to hand them the scale. She had married a man she believed was a poor mountain drifter and found a partner who carried a hidden kingdom in the wild. He had chosen her not as a rescue, but as an equal. Together they turned a secret lodge into a living home and a hard business into something that could stand in the light. The mountains kept their silence, but inside that quiet, they built a life of courage, loyalty, and deep, steady love that no one could ever take away. If this story moved you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more emotional Wild West stories that will touch your soul.